And this one has a different picture as far as the DWP. So overall, your business type activities is moving in the right direction, but there was a strong increase in your net position of 13.6 million, remember, from last year to this year. So your net position overall did increase, but the average unrestricted net position available for future obligations is about 7%, and Corona falls short of that. It's at negative 53%. And so what this means is that the net position of the business type activities for Corona is being held up in capital assets. About 80% of your total assets is infrastructure, which is normal for when you have power and water, and because you have a lot of infrastructure to make those things happen. So a lot of it is in capital assets and then also in capital debt. If you look at your total liabilities, 80% of it is actually capital long-term debt for those facilities. So we'll look at the debt of the business type activities as we get further down. Actually, we'll look at the debt for the entire city in a future slide so we can look at the different debt or how that compares to other cities. But there was a large decrease from your debt in the business type activities from 13 to 14, and I'll explain that too. So overall, in 2013 to 2014, there were positive strides and going the right direction to decrease that negative unrestricted. And it decreased by about $9 million. So we went from a negative 53% to negative 45%. So it is going in the right direction. There were restrictions, did go up a little bit. Actually went up a lot, $10 million, and that was for capital projects that are occurring in the business type activities. So you have different commitments. So a lot of the understanding of why it's a little bit negative or a lot negative in your type is a lot of it is the structure. It's just how you have a capital lease set up, and this is normal when you go to set up your business type activities, you borrow money or you have a capital lease with the city. So there's a big debt on the business type activities that's paying towards the city. So just depending on where the money is going. So right now the debt is on the business type activities. So that's what this is showing you.
Now, you had said these other cities do have business type activities, but I don't think any of those that I can see have power. Electric. They have water.
They don't have electric, and not many cities do.
Right. So that could be part of the reflection on there is because of the power infrastructure that was installed.
Exactly.
Okay.
But the big capital lease structure, I think, is between your water and sewer and the city. And you could correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's water, sewer, in the city.
Yes, it's the Corona Utility Authority.
Okay, so that's a little bit about your net position. What I want to also bring up is a big part of the city is just obligations, debt obligations, pension obligations. So I'm going to bring those up, and so we can compare the city of Corona to these other cities. So when we look at the pension obligation, I know this is on everyone's mind right now, these numbers are going to change drastically next year, and I'll tell you why. But for these numbers right now, the average pension liability was about $435.6 million on all of these cities. That was the average, where Corona's right there in the middle of the average. They're at $431 million. In 2014, it actually did grow, so it went from 431 million to 431 to 451 million. So a lot of things impact the growth of your pension obligation, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of this maybe out in the public, that different things that are going on with CalPERS. So there's a lot of things that change it. There's a lot of assumptions that's made up in your pension obligation. If at any time CalPERS changes any of these assumptions, and I'm talking about the investment return, we had a big jump in the pension obligation when they went from their discounted rate of 7.75 to 7.5. That small percentage change had a big impact on the obligation. So those things happen. Mortality rate, that's always getting looked at. I think every 5 years it's a requirement for them. So those things start to change, will have an impact on your pension obligation. So a lot of these things happen. Since we're looking back to 2012, 2013, some stuff that we did know that happened in CalPERS that changed the impact of their pension liability was just their return on investment was really low at one particular point. It was only at 0.1% in 2012. So that has an impact on your pension obligation. And then just the overall, for your city alone, the positive gains and losses, or the differences between the pension plans. So that's the earnings on the plan, the assumptions that change, the contributions that come in that they expected you to pay, that they thought were going to meet it, versus the benefits that go out. There was a $30 million difference. So that's also contributed to the pension obligation change. One thing I want to note in here and point out why this will change a little bit when we talk about it next year and when you're comparing it to other cities. Most of these cities are similar as far as what we call agent multiple employer plans. So that means you have your own pension plan and you have more than 100 employees in that plan. If at any time you have less than 100 employees, like I think your fire plan is that way, CalPERS requires you to go into a pooled plan. So Temecula is one of those people. They have their fire, but it's in the pooled plan, so that's not reflected on here. At this time, before GASB 68, there was no requirement to know what that pension obligation amount is and to disclose it. All they do is provide a pension obligation for the entire pool. They won't tell you what your proportionate share is. So those numbers are not reflected in there because it's not required to have it, and they don't provide that information. GASB 68 came in and said, you need to provide that information. So now in this current fiscal year, when we complete the audit, you will see the proportionate share for those cost sharing plans, and we will see it for everybody. So we'll be able to get a bigger picture about where everybody's falling on the pension plans. So that's a big difference in this presentation as well, why it'll change a little bit more. Also, another change that's going to be impacted is just the way they value the pension obligation. Before, CalPERS had valued their pension obligation on an actuarial value. So basically, they took their assets and gave it a value over an actuarial period of time. So whether it's a 30-year period of time or a trend, they gave it a value. GASB 68 also came in and said you cannot do that anymore. You need to do it at market value. What's the value of the assets in your plan today if you sold it on the market, and what's the value of the obligation that you owe if you had to pay everybody today in the market? So that's a huge change, because the actual valuation of an asset was down here, and the market, or up here, and the value at the market value is actually down here, growing your unfunded obligation. So you're going to see that impact. So it's not because there's increase in benefits or things like that. It's just a change in accounting principles and how they're going to report it.
You did say, you used the term, well, if you had to pay everybody today. We've got a lot of firefighters, a lot of policemen that are in their 20s. So we don't have to pay them today. We don't have to
No,
pay
just based on what they've earned.
Right.
So not based on their future of 30 years, just based on if they've been here for 2 years, what's that amount? What's the value of that amount?
Okay, very good. The other thing I was going to ask you, I noticed earlier you did use the CAFR report for the city, and according to the CAFR, as far as I remember, that we are up to date on OPEB and also the pension obligations. Isn't that correct?
Okay, that's a difference in accounting. So what you are up to date on is what we call your actual required contribution.
Okay.
So they just tell you this is the amount that you need to pay to be able to sustain your funding policy, whatever your funding policy is. Everybody has a different funding policy. You can have a funding policy to only fund 60% of your obligation. Other cities can have it to fund 80% of their obligation. It all depends on your funding policy. So based on your funding policy and all of these assumptions and calculations, they will give you a required contribution. That is what you pay 100% of every year, not the obligation. The obligation that's unfunded, or the pension obligation that you have, is actually that $451 million.
Thank you.
Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to tell you. Oh, so let's look at the bottom chart really quick, and that's going to actually talk about how much you are funded as far as your pension obligation. So the average percentage that is actually funded on these similar cities is around 83%. So the average of these similar cities, their funded pension obligation is 83%. And Corona's falling a little bit short of that. They're at 71%. And then we dropped a little bit in 2014, which is the red dot, to 63%. So that's the funded portion that you have towards your 451. And now, there you go. And now we're going to look at the OPEB obligation, because you did bring that up as well. Now, your OPEB obligation is, you have the average between these similar cities is about 41 million, and Corona is totaling about 81 million in the OPEB obligation right now, and it did drop in 2014 to 75.8 million. What I want to point out too is that a lot of cities aren't jumping on and funding these, which is important, like putting assets towards them. A lot of them are just paying as you go, which means that as somebody needs to make a claim against that OPEB, they'll write a check for it. And they're not thinking about putting money ahead towards this stuff, because the OPEB liability that we're showing here is a small portion of the total OPEB liability. The GASB pronouncement that was in place to actually provide this OPEB obligation, you won't see it on your books yet. That's going to come following the pension obligation. So you'll be able to see that and see it just like the pension obligation, and it'll be showing in your long-term debt. So right now, that's still falling under old standards where it's just a footnote disclosure. So you kind of have to look through the financial statements to get these numbers. So it's a good thing that Corona has assets towards that. As you could see, not many of them do. Temecula put forth a lot of money towards their OPEB obligation, I think, at one time, but it is a smaller amount.
What assets would you put towards that?
Cash.
Okay.
And it has to go to an irrevocable trust fund, so a fund that you cannot get back.
Now, some cities, now I don't want to jump ahead, but some cities actually financed and bonded for that. Is that any part of this here?
No.
Okay.
No. And
So none of these cities financed for it?
right.
Okay.
Not for the OPEB. Okay, so that we talked about the pension and then the OPEB. Now let's look at your total long-term debt citywide. So this is the total long-term debt compared to other similar cities. So the average debt citywide is about 146 million as far as fiscal year 2013. Now Corona had 206 million, but it did drop to 157 million in 2014. And this is going to explain the big spike that you see at the bottom as well. There was actually just a timing issue, and it's good to talk about these because you can look at the numbers and misinterpret it. It was a timing issue. They actually refinanced a 2003 recycled water project COP bond, and it was recycled in the fiscal year 2013, and because we wasn't able to be called until September. So the bond was issued to refund it. The cash was sitting there, but we couldn't actually pay off the other bond until September. So it's just a timing issue. So that's why you see the big spike as far as the debt compared to everybody else, and then it drops down. And that's why you see the big drop in just your liability overall, was because of the payoff of the refinancing of that one bond. So what the bottom chart does, which I want to talk about, is it's a debt service ratio. So what this looks at is it looks at what obligations you have in the short term, because these debts are paid over 30 years. So what obligations do you have in a one-year term compared to the income that is coming in at that same year? So it looks at what percentage of that income do you have to commit to paying off debt. And so this percentage looks at that total income, and then the average debt service ratio for this is about 15%. So that means they're committing 15% of their total revenue that's coming in. Right off the bat, they have to pay debt service. Corona is well below that. They were at in 2013, it was only 6% of total income is committed to the debt service. for the governmental activities, and then it dropped to 5%. So if we look at the average debt service for the business type activities, which is the red chart, it was laying around 14%, so really similar to government activities. And the only reason why that Corona had the 97% is because of that timing difference. So in reality, it would probably be around 5% if the refinancing all happened within the same fiscal year. So it would have stayed about 5% the way 2014 is.
And obviously the
That's-
percentage of money coming in, income versus debt, has a lot to do with bond rating and things like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And emergencies, you'll see that for liquidity ratios too. Those things are all really important to look at. So that's a great thing. Which brings me to the liquidity. This is the last slide just on the overall fiscal health when you're looking at the general fund, because the general fund is very important to the city. That's the heart of the city, is this general fund. So the liquidity ratio, what this represents is the ability to meet committed expenditures when faced with an emergency. So if something happened, how much cash do you have on to meet your current expenses and keep going? So let's look first at your cash balance. So the first section actually looks at the cash fund of only the general fund. It looks at cash and cash equivalents of similar cities. The average amount of cash that other cities have is about 31.6 million. And you can see Corona is well above that at 63.7 in 2013. And then it did drop slightly to about 60.6 million in 2014. But that's still around twice the average of other cities. And I'll show you how that impacts them. And so the next thing we should look at is just the expenditures, because then we're going to compare the two. So the average general fund expenditures to similar cities is 83 million, where Corona is slightly higher than that. It's 118.7 million. And then it increased to 125.7 million in 2014. So we're going to take those two and compare them together. So what this ratio does is it looks at your ability to maintain paying your expenses using a cash as the emergency fund. Now the shaded area represents a recommended healthy ratio of 3-6. So that's your healthy ratio, meaning you can handle an emergency and still function between 3 and 6 months of the year before you needed to take, take more action. The average liquidity ratio for similar cities is around 5. They hover around 5, which Corona is at 6 for both 2013 and 14. So what you can see is though the expenditures were higher on average compared to the other cities, the large cash balance is actually still providing a very healthy liquidity ratio to handle any emergency events. So that's great. So that is the analysis.
So before you go on from that, so this graph is indicating that Escondido, Fairfield, Fullerton, Garden Grove, and Oxnard are below what is the safe band to cover for 3 to 6 months should there be an emergency, disaster, or something like that.
Exactly, in their general fund. The general fund's the heart of it. We're just looking at general fund. They're well below the healthy ratio.
Thank you.